Dams. We all know what they are, we've seen them, but do we really know what they're for or what they're doing for the environment? Are they good for the environment? Are they bad? Should we keep building them? All of your questions and more will be answered. To answer these questions, I asked my friends to rank coal, natural gas, and hydropower from dams from best to worst for the environment. And here's what they said. You'll notice there's supreme excitement to participate, and these are really my friends, not paid actors.
Hi. Coal's definitely the worst. I'd say natural gas isn't great, but hydropower isn't great either because the concrete from dams puts out a lot of greenhouse emitters. So, but hydropower is probably the most efficient, and then natural gas being second.
I'd say hydropowers are the best, natural gas is second, and coal is last.
I would say best would be the dams, and then
coal and natural gas.
and the second would be natural gas, and then third would be coal.
I feel like the best would be hydropower from dams, then natural gas, then coal. Okay, best hydropower, natural gas, and then worst is coal.
So worst would be coal, followed probably closely by natural gas, and then dams.
I feel like the best would be hydropower from dams.
I feel like the best would be hydropower from dams.
The truth is, all those innocent people have been lied to about the dangers of dams to our ecosystems and society. As you can see, they pretty much all agree that coal is bad, natural gas is a little bit better, and hydropower is the best of all. Many of these people have taken ecology or environmental science at K, so their answers are well educated, but misinformed. Hydropower from dams can actually have a more profound negative effect on the environment than burning fossil fuels if it's at a large enough scale. So let's unpack a little bit about why dams might be so harmful to the environment. As you can see, this large cement dam is really constructed by this large cement retaining wall that blocks the flow of the river and the nutrients that usually would travel downstream. The wall creates a reservoir of still upstream water, expanding widely and flooding the surrounding riverbed when it's put in. The oxygen that once flowed with the water has decreased, and the reservoir becomes a breeding ground for bacteria and a death sentence for the river's plants and animals. The reservoir is no longer hospitable for the river's critters, so they'll likely die in this new setting. Their decomposition by the water's bacteria releases CO2 and methane into the air, really harmful greenhouse gases. Downstream there's movement, but the sediment that once flowed down to provide nutrients to the organisms is trapped in excess behind the wall, even becoming a flooding hazard because there's so much pressure. The downstream organisms are nutrient poor and trapped in the downstream river section. They can no longer swim upstream. Their habitat is simplified too because less water is flowing through the river, so you don't get the little riffles and runs that rivers are characterized by, giving different habitats for different organisms.
Damn!
From the methane released to the reduced health of the river ecosystems, many studies show that dams can release just as much, if not more, greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as fossil fuels. This is a staggering statement that goes against most of what we've been taught in elementary school, all the way up to even at K College. So if dams are so bad for rivers, why even build them? The answer is more political than ecological. There are several reasons why dams are put in rivers, because they provide water for irrigation, domestic use, industry, recreation, flood control, and electricity. Many of these reasons are greatly important, but because there are energetic alternatives to hydropower that are less environmentally invasive, like solar or wind, how necessary are these dams? Less than 3% of the United States' more than 80,000 dams are used for electricity production. And in the US, under 7% of our electricity usage is hydropower. Thousands of dams in the US were constructed over 50 years ago, so aging infrastructure is only lowering their efficiency. Essentially, there are very few useful dams in the US for energy production whose energetic benefit outweighs their environmental cost, and dams are only getting more popular. The truth is that dams are a huge investment in a display of power in public infrastructure for government leaders, So the large projects are a popular undertaking when the actual quantity of work and costs associated with the construction of the dam will not be paid back by the energy created for decades. And the financial and environmental toll that a dam takes on a community, especially those who are displaced by its production, cannot be restored. Dam production is set to increase by over 200% in the coming decade in China and India as a way to boost clean energy production. Theoretically, this sounds great, but actually the environmental costs of dams are much greater than those of solar or wind, which would be better counterparts. These dams are mostly large-scale projects, often called mega dams, which displace residents and create huge reservoirs, and as we learned earlier, those are carbon sources. One of the other major problems with these large-scale infrastructure projects is that there are secondary effects. The dams that we're talking about aren't usually being placed in places that are already developed. They're usually put in more remote areas like the Amazon or the Andes regions that will require extensive road and power line networks to be put in. This is going to increase deforestation in those areas, and it's going to displace the people who are living there in an already remote area. So it's not just the environmental effects of the dam anymore, it's the secondary effects that are permeating through the entire community. After introducing earlier that solar and wind energy might be better alternatives to hydropower, I wanted to use this chart to unpack a little bit more about why that is true. So, looking at this graph, all of three of these power sources are renewable energy because they come from a theoretically infinite supply of resources, so water, sun, and wind. But in terms of which one is the most energy efficient in production, hydropower comes in last, so it has very inefficient energy production relative to its size and the energy it takes to actually run it. Solar power has slightly better energy efficiency, and wind has the best energy efficiency of all. In terms of ease of access and growth of these infrastructures, what I mean by this is how easy it is to create the infrastructure, put it in place, and continue adding to it as technology advances over the years. So hydropower is the least easy to access and grow because once it's put in, it's set in stone and it's really challenging to change, whereas solar and wind energy are much, much easier to expand upon. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, hydropower has the most greenhouse gas emissions, with solar power second and wind third. Solar power produces greenhouse gas emissions because of the materials it takes to create solar power, and also oftentimes there's some deforestation in the areas that solar panels are put in. But that's not necessarily directly tied to putting in solar panels, it's often already there. And finally, when talking about a disturbance to natural ecosystems in general, hydropower definitely has the greatest disturbance on existing ecosystems, as we've learned throughout this whole video, with wind in second place with slightly less disturbance, or I would say significantly less disturbance. Most of the time, the only argument for wind being destructive to the environment is against birds, when we found that actually birds are mostly killed by collisions with cars and buildings. It's not really a large proportion at all that are killed by wind turbines. And finally is solar panels, which are found to be very non-invasive and non-disturbing to the existing environment. So as you can see, dams are definitely not the only source of renewable energy that we have in the future, and we need to be looking more towards solar and wind for all of these reasons. The next question becomes then, what do we do with all these dams that are just sitting there, or that need to be torn down, or that are too old to be useful? And the answer is that we could take them down. It's a complex process far beyond simply blowing up the dam and letting the river return to its normal state. There must be diversion and careful planning to control the flow of the freed river after it's starting to be torn down. It's definitely a process. Scientists have found that it takes decades for the river to return to its natural flow with all of its organisms and the ecosystem services that the river provides. And some changes to surrounding plant life cannot be recovered at all without intense intervention, and even with that, sometimes it's impossible. The enormous cleanup effort associated with removing dams is all the more reason to avoid them and find alternatives in the first place. With the increased need to move to something besides dams, and especially with the impending doom of increasing them by over 200% in some of the largest, most highly populated countries in the world, here are some tools to create better informed infrastructure decisions and prevent further environmental harm. Research suggests that improving screening for costs prior to construction is really helpful in terms of making sure that there are the proper funds to be able to finish the project in a timely manner. Oftentimes, large dam projects are far more costly than companies predict, sending the government into a deep economic pit and the people stranded with a half-finished infrastructure project in their backyard. Another strategy is to include more environmental specialists in the decision-making and designing process of dams, to better design the infrastructure with the true environmental costs in mind. Finally, it's important for governments not to fall victim to believing that if they don't build an invasive infrastructure, a different company will, and they'll do it at a lower price and a lower quality, creating more environmental harm. This is a common pressure that pushes industries to develop prematurely or head somewhere that they don't belong. Involving NGOs and increasing public education on the issues surrounding these projects also helps to pull back the curtain on large governmental decisions that profoundly impact human lives, because at the end of the day, citizens are the ones who have to live with these decisions, and they're ones who should be benefiting from the infrastructure.
Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and informative about why there are dams in your community, what the problems with them might be, and potentially how you can avoid having them created in the future.
So what we think is that dams are a damn shame. Spread the word.